True War Encounters, Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used FG-42 in 1944 with iron will to save his team. The FG-42 lay in the mud like a broken promise. Jake McNiece crouched in the hedgerow darkness, rain streaking his face, and stared at the rifle half buried beside the dead German paratrooper. The weapon's distinctive long barrel caught what little moonlight broke through the fog rolling across the Norman hedgerows. Behind him, 200 yards back through flooded ditches and torn earth, 7 men from the Filthy 13 were pinned inside a collapsed barn, trapped by sustained MG-42 fire from a farmhouse they'd stumbled into through the June mist. The mission had been clean on paper: drop near Sainte-Mère-Église, demolish the stone bridge at dawn, deny German armor a crossing point into the American beachhead. But the C-47 had taken flak over the coast, and McNiece's stick had scattered across 2 miles of enemy-controlled bocage. By the time he'd rallied 7 paratroopers, half their explosives were lost in flooded fields, and German patrols owned every road and hedgerow between them and the bridge. Now McNiece held the only functional rifle within reach. His Thompson had jammed after the firefight that killed the Fallschirmjäger. The rest of his squad was trapped with dwindling ammunition, no radio, and German reinforcements closing from 3 sides. The FG-42 felt foreign in his hands, heavier than his Thompson, balanced differently, the selector switch unfamiliar. But it was loaded, and it was all he had. He'd recognized Private Duquesne's voice inside the barn, hoarse, panicked, calling for covering fire. Corporal Bowers was in there too, probably with a jammed carbine like half the weapons after that wet jump. The MG-42 swept fire across the barn entrance every 30 seconds, methodical and patient. Behind it, McNiece could hear bootsteps in the hedgerows, voices calling in clipped German. Minutes, maybe less, before they surrounded the barn completely. Officers back at regiment would call what he was thinking reckless. McNiece called it the only choice that didn't involve writing letters to 7 mothers. He checked the FG-42's magazine in the dim light. 20 rounds. The dead German had maintained it well. The action was smooth despite the mud. McNiece had seen these rifles before, pulled from dead Fallschirmjäger near Carentan last week. Lethal at range, reliable. The Luftwaffe's airborne troops carried them for a reason. His hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from 36 hours without sleep, bruised ribs from a hard landing, and the weight of knowing that what happened in the next 5 minutes would either save his men or add 7 more names to the 506th's casualty list. The fog thickened. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. McNiece tightened his grip on the FG-42. Feeling the cold steel against his burned fingers, and began to crawl forward through the mud toward the farmhouse. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The plan had unraveled before McNiece's boots hit Norman soil. Lieutenant Winters had briefed them aboard the C-47. 12 men, 3 Bangalore torpedoes, enough TNT and primacord to drop the bridge's center span into the river. Simple, clean, the kind of demolition McNiece could rig in his sleep. But somewhere over the channel, flak had shredded their flight path. The green light came too early or too late, McNiece never knew which, and the Filthy 13 scattered across the bocage like seeds in a storm. He'd landed hard in a flooded ditch, harness tangled in blackthorn, and spent 20 minutes cutting himself free, while German voices echoed through the fog. By dawn, he'd found Duquesne shivering behind a hedgerow, then Bowers with a twisted ankle, then 5 more, but no Bangalores, no radio, and only half the explosives they needed. Still, McNiece had pressed toward the bridge, because that's what demolition men did. You didn't quit because the drop went wrong or the gear was scattered. You improvised. Then the fog had thickened near the farmhouse, and Duquesne, exhausted, disoriented, had stumbled into the open. The MG-42 opened up instantly. Now here they were, 7 men trapped, One NCO outside with a dead enemy's rifle, and German patrols converging like wolves. McNiece crawled through the hedgerow, FG-42 cradled against his chest, counting seconds between MG-42 bursts. 12 seconds, reload time, barrel change, or repositioning. 12 seconds to make the shot that might give his men a chance. 50 yards from the farmhouse, he could see the muzzle flash in the second-floor window. 2 gunners, maybe 3. The building's stone walls were pocked with shell fire from earlier fighting. American or German, impossible to tell. A cart lay overturned in the yard, its contents scattered. The smell of cordite hung thick in the wet air. Behind him, inside the barn, someone coughed. A wet, painful sound. Shrapnel wound, probably. McNiece's jaw tightened. Every second he waited was another second closer to encirclement. But rushing the shot meant wasting his only advantage. He thought of the Fallschirmjäger lying dead in the hedgerow. Young, maybe 20. The FG-42 had been slung across his back when McNiece's knife found his throat. Quick, silent, necessary. The German's eyes had gone wide with surprise, then empty. McNiece had pulled the rifle free without looking at the face, because looking made it harder to do what came next. Now that rifle was his only tool. He'd never trained on German weapons, never qualified on anything but the Thompson, M1 Garand, and the occasional bar. But metal was metal, triggers were triggers, and desperate men learned fast. The FG-42's sights lined up clean. The safety clicked off smooth. The weight felt wrong, but McNiece had carried plenty of things that felt wrong in Normandy. Fear, responsibility, the knowledge that good men died when he guessed poorly. The MG-42 fired again, a long, brutal burst that chewed splinters from the barn's doorframe. McNiece counted 1, 2, 3. At 8, he rose to one knee, sighted through the iron sights, and squeezed the trigger. The FG-42 kicked hard against McNiece's shoulder. 3 controlled bursts that shattered the farmhouse window and sent the MG-42 silent. Glass cascaded, a scream cut short. Then nothing but the ringing in McNiece's ears and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the hedgerows. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He was already moving, sprinting low through the fog toward the barn, the FG-42 hot in his grip, boots churning mud. Behind him, German voices erupted in sharp commands. Rifle fire cracked. Rounds snapped past his head, close enough to feel the displacement. He dove through the barn doorway as bullets chewed into the wooden frame. Inside, 7 faces stared at him through the dim light, pale, streaked with mud and exhaustion. Duquesne clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Bowers had his carbine torn apart on the ground, trying to clear a jammed casing with shaking hands. The rest had maybe 30 rounds between them, and the look in their eyes said they'd been counting each one like prayers. "Sarge," Duquesne rasped, "they got us boxed." "Not yet, they don't." McNiece slapped a fresh magazine into the FG-42, scavenged from the dead German's pouch along with 2 more, 3 magazines total, 60 rounds. He'd worked with less. "I cleared the farmhouse gun. We move now. Through the north hedgerow, fast and low. Anyone falls, we carry them." "That's suicide," someone muttered. McNiece looked at him, a replacement whose name he'd never learned, fresh-faced and terrified. "Staying here's worse. Germans are moving to surround us. 5 minutes, maybe less, and we're cut off completely. So we move. Now." It wasn't a plan. It was iron will wrapped in desperation and the stubborn refusal to let good men die waiting for orders that would never come. They moved in pairs, McNiece covering with the FG-42 while his men scrambled through gaps in the hedgerow. The fog helped, thick as wool, turning the bocage into a maze of shadows and sudden shapes. German patrols converged, shouting coordinates, but the chaos and mist gave McNiece's squad precious seconds of confusion. He fired in short bursts, never emptying the magazine, never exposing his position for more than a heartbeat. The FG-42 became an extension of his will, each round buying 3 more yards for his men. Every pause to reload was calculated against the sound of German boots closing in. Somewhere in the confusion, Bowers got his carbine working again. The replacement kid found his nerve and laid down covering fire while McNiece dragged Duquesne across a sunken lane. The world narrowed to movement, fire, and the desperate mathematics of ammunition versus distance. Halfway to American lines, they hit a German squad moving up to reinforce the farmhouse. No time to think, no time for fear to freeze him. McNiece dropped to prone, braced the FG-42 against the muddy embankment, and opened fire. The Germans scattered. His men crossed the road. Bowers emptied his carbine. The FG-42's bolt locked back empty. McNiece threw it aside and pulled his knife, but the Germans had pulled back, regrouping or mistaking the ferocity for a larger force. It didn't matter. His men were moving. They were alive. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. They reached American lines at dawn, 7 mud-covered paratroopers, half-carrying Duquesne through a gap in the hedgerows where Easy Company had dug in overnight. A young Lieutenant McNiece didn't recognize, stared at them like ghosts emerging from fog. "McNiece," the officer said slowly, "where the hell's your squad? Where's the bridge?" McNiece leaned against a stone wall, legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline burn. His hands still trembled, not from fear now, but from the aftermath, the body's rebellion after pushing past every limit. "Bridge is still standing, sir. We got scattered in the drop, lost our demolition gear, ran into German patrols." He paused, breathing hard. "Got my men out instead." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Your orders were to demolish that bridge." "My orders assumed we'd land in the right drop zone with the right equipment and no enemy contact." McNiece's voice came out flat, drained of the rebellious edge that usually colored his words. "Ground truth was different, sir. Made a call." Behind him, Bowers was checking Duquesne's shoulder wound. The replacement kid sat against a wall, staring at nothing. The others drank from canteens with shaking hands, the silence between them heavy with what they'd just survived. The lieutenant opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He'd seen McNiece's reputation in reports, the troublemaker, the Filthy 13's demolition expert, who bent rules and ignored haircut regulations. But he was also looking at 7 paratroopers who should be dead or captured, standing here because an NCO with a captured German rifle had decided that saving lives mattered more than following a plan the enemy had already shredded. "Where's your weapon, Sergeant?" "Left it in a hedgerow, sir. Ran dry." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What were you carrying?" McNiece met his gaze. "Whatever worked." There was a long silence. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the battle for Normandy ground forward. Men dying for yards of mud and stone, for bridges and roads and objectives that looked clean on maps, but turned to chaos on the ground. "Get your men some food," the lieutenant finally said. "Then report to battalion. They'll want to hear about enemy positions." McNiece nodded, too exhausted to argue or explain. He pushed off the wall and walked toward where his squad had collapsed in the grass. Duquesne looked up at him, face gray with pain and blood loss, and managed something that might have been a smile. "Sarge," he said quietly, "that German rifle you used—" "Forget about it," McNiece cut him off. His voice was gentle but firm. "It's done. We're here. That's what matters." But Bowers was staring at him with an expression McNiece couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and unease, respect, and the uncomfortable knowledge that what had just happened in those hedgerows didn't fit the clean narratives they'd been trained to follow. McNiece had used an enemy weapon to save American lives. He'd abandoned his primary objective to protect his men. He'd made split-second decisions that could have gotten everyone killed, but instead had gotten them home. And somewhere in the fog and mud behind them, the FG-42 lay discarded. a piece of German engineering that had briefly become the difference between 7 men living or dying, now just another piece of wreckage in the Norman bocage. 3 days later, McNiece sat in a cellar near Carentan, cleaning his newly issued Thompson while Bowers wrote letters by candlelight. The damp stone walls pressed close. Outside, rain drummed on rubble. The bridge they'd been supposed to destroy had finally been hit by P-47s, turned to twisted steel and concrete dust by bombs McNiece could have placed with a fraction of the explosives and none of the risk to pilots. "You going to tell them the truth?" Bowers asked without looking up. McNiece didn't pretend not to understand. "About what?" "About being scared. About how close we came." Bowers set down his pencil. "The lieutenant's writing you up for something. Heard him talking to the captain. Resourcefulness under fire. Initiative in adverse conditions." McNiece's hands stilled on the Thompson's bolt. The metal felt cold and familiar. Nothing like the FG-42's unfamiliar weight, the way it had kicked against his shoulder, the split second of doubt before he'd trusted a dead enemy's weapon with his men's lives. "I was terrified," he said quietly. "Whole time. Thought I was going to get everyone killed. But you didn't. Pure luck. Could have gone wrong a dozen ways." McNiece resumed cleaning, the motions automatic. "That FG-42 could have jammed, could have been empty. I could have missed the farmhouse window, wasted our only chance. The Germans could have cut us off before we reached the hedgerow." Bowers was quiet for a long moment. "But you still made the call. Picked up that rifle. Went after the MG-42. Wasn't brave. Was just the only thing I could think to do." McNiece looked up, meeting Bowers' eyes. "You know what kept running through my head while I was crawling toward that farmhouse? Not tactics, not training. Just, if I screw this up, Duquesne dies. You die. Everyone in that barn dies. And I have to live with knowing I guessed wrong. That's what courage is, Sarge. Doing it anyway even when you're shaking." McNiece shook his head. "Courage is what they'll write in the citation. What I felt was panic with a thin coat of stubbornness over it. Couldn't let you guys down. Couldn't walk away, so I picked up that German rifle and hoped to God I remembered which end the bullets came out of." He'd never tell them about the moment after he fired, the half-second when he thought he'd missed, when he'd been certain the MG-42 would swing toward him and cut him in half, or the way his hands had shaken so badly loading the second magazine that he'd nearly dropped it in the mud, or how he'd wanted to vomit from fear and adrenaline the entire sprint back to the barn. The official story would be clean. Sergeant McNiece, using a captured enemy weapon, eliminated an enemy position and extracted his squad under fire. Initiative, resourcefulness, the kind of action that looked good in reports and justified the Army's tolerance of the filthy 13's eccentricities. What they wouldn't write, the terror, the doubt, the desperate improvisation, the weight of 7 lives pressing down on every decision. The way his nerve had nearly broken 3 times, held together only by the knowledge that breaking meant men died. The luck, pure, stupid luck, that the FG-42 had worked, that the Germans had hesitated, that the fog had held long enough. "The bridge," Bowers started, "is gone now anyway," McNiece finished. 3 days late and at the cost of aircraft and pilots, but we'd have gotten there eventually, if we'd had the gear, if the drop hadn't scattered us." He paused. "Saving you guys was the right call, even if some officer disagrees." The citation came through 2 weeks later. Brief, clean, stripped of the fear and chaos that had defined those minutes in the Norman fog. McNiece read it once, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket without comment. The filthy 13 ribbed him about it over cigarettes and bad coffee, their voices carrying the particular humor of men who'd seen too much to take medals seriously. But Duquesne, shoulder-bandaged and arm in a sling, had found McNiece alone later that day. He'd simply nodded. No words, just that quiet acknowledgement between men who'd stared at death together and walked away. McNiece had nodded back. Some things didn't need explaining. By July, they were preparing for the next jump. New missions, new drop zones, new bridges to blow. The FG-42 had faded into another piece of wartime debris scattered across France. One more artifact of improvisation and survival lost to mud and history. But sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, McNiece would feel the unfamiliar weight of that rifle in his hands again. The cold steel, the kick of the recoil, the sound of shattering glass and the sudden silence of the MG-42. And beneath it all, the memory of crawling through fog toward an enemy position with nothing but a dead man's weapon, and the iron-willed refusal to let his squad die waiting. Years later, long after Normandy and Market Garden, after Bastogne and the final surrender, an interviewer would ask Jake McNiece about the most difficult decision he'd made during the war. He thought for a long time, fingers unconsciously tracing old scars, before answering. "Every time I had to choose between the mission on paper and the men right in front of me," he said finally. "Every time I had to trust my gut against what command expected. Every time I had to pick up whatever worked, regulation or not, and make it count." The interviewer pressed for details, for the heroic stories that had filtered through regimental histories and veteran reunions. McNiece gave them the official version: dates, places, objectives achieved or abandoned. But he kept the weight of it to himself. The terror, the doubt, the desperate mathematics of ammunition and distance, the way his hands had shaken, the faces of men who'd trusted him not to guess wrong. The story that survived in records was simple. Demolition NCO uses captured enemy rifle to extract trapped squad under fire. Clean, heroic. The kind of tale that fit neatly into an afternoon documentary or regimental history. What McNiece carried, what all of them carried, was heavier and harder to compress into words. The sound of boots in mud, the smell of cordite and rain, the split-second choices that could save or doom, the thin line between courage and recklessness, discipline and survival, legend and the messy, terrified truth of making it through one more day. The FG-42 lay somewhere in the Norman bocage still, buried under decades of soil and memory. But the weight of wielding it, of choosing to act when every instinct screamed to freeze, that stayed with McNiece until the end. Not as pride or trauma, but as the simple, complicated reality of what it meant to be the man others trusted when plans collapsed and only improvisation and will remained. The legend was light, made of paper and clean narratives. The memory was iron, cold, heavy, and impossibly real. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.